Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to EOTT, and I have a fantastic show for you today, ladies and gentlemen. I've been lucky enough to secure Dr. Devin Terhune to come and have a chat with us. Dr. Terhune, how are you, sir?
Good, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, brother. Very well indeed. Thank you for coming and have a chat with us.
Yeah, no
to
problem.
Give you guys,
invite.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll give you a bit of a background with Dr. Terhune. He works out of Goldsmiths University. He's a prolific researcher into the fields of time perception and consciousness in altered states in clinical populations. We'll also be getting into his research on suggestion, hypnosis, and placebo as well as his broader interests in kind of awareness, metacognition, functional neurological and dissociative disorders, for which Devin's research utilizes a variety of techniques, including kind of MRI machines, EEG machines, non-invasive brain stimulation, eye tracking, as well as a diverse array of statistical approaches. So my man has got his bases covered. There'll be many folks already familiar with Devin's work because as well as publishing 3 books and multiple articles and research papers, Devin regularly gives talks in public arenas such as the Breaking Convention, which is where I was lucky enough to stumble upon your fantastic work. And quite impressively, he's consulted for documentaries, TV programs, and plays concerning psychological phenomena within his field of expertise. And his research has also been featured in major national and international news outlets such as the New York Times, Guardian, New Scientist, and Science magazine. So quite the resume there, Dr. Terhune. You're on the cutting edge, which is where we like to be. We like to speak to everyone on the cutting edge. So if you would be so kind, brother, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you kind of got to where you are now and the things you're doing.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite and all the nice comments. One very minor correction on my CV.
By all means.
I've never published any books.
Oh, my mistake. On the page, it seems that you have 3 books published. Are they kind of contributions to the works, or?
They might be book chapters or something.
I see.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Not to worry. No, I'll put that in the description box, and I'll put the links in there for everyone. But thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
No problem. Yeah, so again, thanks for the invite. So as you mentioned, I have a broad set of interests. Most of it kind of hones in on various features of consciousness. It kind of all starts for me during my undergrad, which was at Concordia University in Montreal. During that time, I became very interested in hallucinations, particularly in non-clinical individuals. So I was kind of, going through the literature on schizophrenia and other conditions, but I became more fascinated by the finding, which was far less studied at the time, of hallucinations in healthy individuals. So when I did my undergrad, which was quite a while back now, that topic was far more neglected than it is now. So it's increasingly kind of recognized, for example, that individuals have hallucinations on a regular basis and can be actually quite healthy and otherwise, for lack of a better word, otherwise normal. So we would now refer to these individuals as voice hearers, for example.
Okay.
During this time, I became very interested in those individuals, reporting hallucinations and various types of methods for inducing hallucinations in various types of contexts and environments. So I was fortunate enough to get a chance during my undergrad to study hypnosis with Professor J.R. Laurence at Concordia, who is one of the first people in the world to use hypnosis to induce false memories back in the late 70s, early 80s. And this was really kind of a prominent and very important and significant advance in our understanding of memories and false memories more broadly. So I was able to study with J.R. Laurence. I learned a lot about hypnosis from him, individual differences in hypnotic suggestibility. So basically how suggestible someone is in the context of hypnosis. And I became very much appreciative of hypnosis as a technique for modulating consciousness in various ways, and in particular inducing hallucinations. So hypnosis is incredibly valuable for inducing hallucinations in very highly suggestible individuals. So subsequently, during my master's, I looked at whether you could induce hallucinations through a coupling of verbal suggestions, so giving suggestions to people that they would experience hallucinations in certain contexts, and coupling this with a very unusual technique, which is still very underused, which is mirror gazing. So basically what we would do is we would ask people to gaze into a mirror where they actually couldn't see themselves. It was tilted ever so slightly towards the ceiling, so they never actually see their own face.
Okay.
And it's basically in a very dimly lit room. And so the mirror basically takes on this kind of translucent grayish color. And so it basically functions as basically just a clear source of noise, all right?
Right.
Visual noise in one's environment, basically, a very ambiguous stimulus. And so we know that ambiguous, noisy stimuli are very conducive to hallucinations. And that's something that's kind of widely accepted now. So this mirror gazing technique is still very underused. It's more commonly used now as a way to induce dissociative states like depersonalization, derealization, where you actually look at your own face in a mirror. And this is known to kind of trigger those types of experiences. And that technique is much more commonly used. But this technique of the tilted mirror was not, and still isn't really very widely used. Once in a while, you'll see a paper on it. Anyway, that study was fairly successful. We ended up publishing it, and subsequently, I worked as a research assistant for a year, and we did some interesting studies. I was in Boston on yoga and how it affects your different types of neurochemicals in the brain, and might be an effective technique for treating anxiety and depression. And my old mentor there, Chris Streeter, who's at Boston University School of Medicine, continues to do really nice work in that area. Subsequently, I went on and did my PhD on cognitive neuroscience and hypnosis. The topic there was really very, very niche, and so it's kind of a bit outside of the scope maybe for your audience, but basically it really boils down to the question of whether highly suggestible individuals, so people who are very, very highly responsive to hypnosis, who are basically the upper 5 to 10% of the population, so incredibly highly suggestible individuals, we were basically testing the idea of whether there might be different subgroups of very highly suggestible individuals. And simply put, we're looking at the idea that there might be one subtype that has a kind of what would be understood to be a dissociative profile. So these are people with very pronounced dissociative states, things like depersonalization, derealization, detachment from oneself, from one's environment in their daily lives. And that might look conceptually similar to individuals with full-blown dissociative disorders, even though they are not inherently pathological, all right? And so I won't go into, we did a bunch of studies on this, but the overarching message was that we actually found pretty good evidence that there does indeed seem to be a small subgroup of very highly suggestible individuals who seem to be also very highly dissociative. And there's still a lot of outstanding questions about this topic. I haven't really been doing much on that lately just because it's an incredible challenge. Because basically in order to do research on this, you need to get about 30 or 40 of these very highly suggestible people who might be only about 5% of the population. Yeah. So essentially you need to screen upwards of 600 to 700 participants in their level of hypnotic suggestibility to then identify these individuals. So it's really a challenging undertaking, but we've done a little bit more here and there on various aspects of this.
Are you able to quickly, sorry to interject, are you able to kind of give an idea of what are the kind of markers then, if you like, for these kind of highly suggestible people with regards to that kind of neurocognitive profile? Is there any kind of...
Sure. I mean, across the board, there's not really anything that's kind of super easy to identify, but the best kind of self-report measure that seems to be generally pretty good, and anecdotally, we also tended to find this amongst our participants, is that they tend to have a pronounced tendency for states of absorption in their daily lives. So we all experience absorption from time to time. It's basically just this experience where you become so immersed in some type of activity, you lose awareness of what's going on around you. So it can happen in a variety of contexts. It might happen while you're reading an excellent novel, and you find that 2 hours has passed and you didn't really look at the clock, you didn't do anything else. Obviously, it can happen while you're watching a film. You get so engaged in the film, you really feel like you're part of the narrative, maybe even. It can happen at concerts. Over time, we've kind of found that it seems to happen in a wide variety of contexts. One of the most highly suggestible individuals I ever worked with, he would actually get it while he was doing computer coding. So he would sit there writing code, and he would have these pronounced states of absorption where he would write code for like 3 hours. And
getting into the zone then, as you say.
Yeah, it's almost like, yeah, so it's conceptually similar with getting into the zone.
Okay.
So these individuals, there's a decent amount of evidence that they seem to be prone to these types of states, but unfortunately that research strand has been heavily neglected, and there's not really, to my knowledge, there's not really any really robust methods for formally studying absorption in a controlled context. It's more measured with questionnaires. Questionnaires can be valuable, but the measures of absorption are quite messy because they ask about things like what I've just described, but they also ask questions like, have you ever had any psychic experiences and things like that. So it's hard to disentangle that. But that if you were to kind of put money on anything, the tendency to get very absorbed in one's activities tends to be kind of just subjectively one of the most clear predictors of somebody who's very highly suggestible. Some other things that are closely related to that are that highly suggestible individuals seem to be much more empathic and maybe are more likely to have experiences of emotional contagion. So maybe picking up on the emotional states of other people. There's some evidence for that. There's some evidence that individuals that are less mindful are also more highly suggestible. So highly suggestible individuals may have less mindfulness.
Does that kind of would you say being less mindful would be more kind of self-absorbed? Is that fair to say, or maybe not? Or?
No, I think probably not necessarily self-absorbed, but just kind of a little bit more detached from one's mental states, perhaps.
So not keeping on top of their thoughts, then, so to speak.
Yeah. So there's a few studies from really good research group at the University of Sussex that kind of hinted at that. I think it's a little bit preliminary, but there's some hints of that certainly. There's some evidence to indicate that highly suggestible individuals might be more creative and more able to adopt roles in a kind of a convincing way. So there's some evidence, for example, that they're more, that they're better at adopting kind of dramatic roles. So like actors, for example, and individuals that partake in drama seem to be more highly suggestible. There's some evidence for that. Again, not a ton of evidence, but basically a tendency to kind of maybe get immersed in one's environment to the point that you feel like you're really experiencing it. And then more broadly, there is some evidence these individuals might be more prone to various types of alterations in consciousness and altered states of consciousness and hallucinations and other anomalous experiences in their daily lives. Again, that line of research is kind of hasn't received the attention that I think it deserves, but there's certainly some hints that these people might be kind of more prone to various types of changes in their subjective experience. Again, the group at University of Sussex has some recent evidence that's in line with that general idea, as have some other groups. So basically, we're also interested in this in terms of the dimensions with regard to psychopathology. So there's a long line of research going back to the 19th century of linking suggestibility in both a hypnotic context as well as non-hypnotic context with what are known as functional neurological disorders. So functional neurological disorders are various types of conditions in which an individual displays a seemingly neurological symptom. A classic example would be a seizure, but it lacks the classic organic medical neurophysiological characteristics. So they won't have the typical epileptiform activity, for example, in the EEG. Another example might be paralysis. An individual can't move their arm, but there doesn't appear to be any organic basis.
Right.
Historically, these conditions have been referred to as psychogenic. So they're kind of like originating from some type of psychological disturbance. But we have to be careful because it's an oversimplification to refer them as solely psychogenic, because there's clearly some kind of neurophysiological basis, but they're just deviating from the kind of the classic conventional neurological basis, if you will.
Right. Yeah.
But there's a long-standing tradition of linking suggestibility with what were previously known as psychogenic conditions. And so the idea was that if a symptom that somebody displayed was responsive to suggestion, then it was more likely to be psychogenic. Or if a symptom responded to a placebo, placebos have a major element of placebo is suggestion, then they would be psychogenic. This is for reasons I can expand upon later if you're interested, but this idea is now, I believe, is actually false, strictly speaking, although I do believe that these conditions seem to be characterized by elevated levels of suggestibility. In other words, there is some evidence, for example, that you can trigger seizures through suggestion in patients that have epilepsy, which would suggest that epileptic seizures can be triggered through suggestion. So if you trigger a seizure through suggestion, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a psychogenic or a functional symptom.
Okay.
But anyways, in the 19th century, there was this, emerged this link between what was then known as hysteria. Subsequently, it was known as conversion disorder. Now it's known as functional neurological disorders. Conversion disorder or hysteria also included other conditions such as what is now known as dissociative identity disorder and other conditions. Nevertheless, perhaps the most prominent ones were these various types of paralyses, amnesias, and so on that now fall under functional neurological disorders. So anyways, the second kind of lens through which we're understanding these different subtypes of highly suggestible individuals is that this dissociative subtype, we believe, has an elevated predisposition. So they're more prone to developing psychopathology. So there's a fairly large number of studies indicating that number of different functional neurological disorder patients, dissociative disorder patients, and other conditions that are very similar, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, which also often has a strong dissociative component to it, that these disorders are typically characterized by higher levels of hypnotic suggestibility. So all these different disorders seem to be associated with a greater responsiveness to hypnotic suggestions. So we believe that studying this dissociative subtype, that these individuals may be at a increased risk for developing psychopathology. And this is something we studied again in a recent paper that we published earlier this year. One of my students basically did a fairly complicated statistical model that basically seems to indicate that if you're highly suggestible and you are exposed to a traumatic event, then you're more likely to display very high levels of dissociation. There's some other kind of complexities in the model I won't go into, but this is kind of consistent broadly with this idea that's been proposed, in different forms over many decades, that these highly suggestible individuals, when confronted with trauma, seem to be more prone to high levels of dissociation and perhaps under certain circumstances, dissociative disorders or maybe functional neurological disorders. So that's the general gist of that line of work. And we continue to do a fair amount of work on hypnosis and suggestibility in different contexts. After my PhD, which was in Lund University in Sweden, which is a pretty interesting place to be in, I was then fortunate enough to get funding for 5 years to study at the University of Oxford as a postdoctoral research fellow. So I worked in the lab of Roy Cohen-Kadosh, who is an international expert in non-invasive brain stimulation. And he does a number of different studies, but his lab is primarily focused these days on cognitive training in both early adolescents, but also in adults, using different types of cognitive training paradigms, coupling them with non-invasive brain stimulation, and then looking at the neural substrates of improvements or augmentation effects in various types of cognitive phenomena. And so in Oxford, I spent a lot of time doing brain stimulation studies and gained a good appreciation for a lot of those methods, along with other types of imaging methods and so on. And there I became I was always interested in time perception, all the way back from my undergrad, which is actually, my undergrad degree was actually in philosophy. And I was very interested in a number of different subdomains within philosophy. I was particularly interested in the phenomenology of time and the experience of time and how informative our experience of time is to our experience of consciousness from moment to moment, but also how it informs our our long-term experience of identity and things like this. So there I became interested in time perception, or I was able to kind of, during that time, I had the freedom to explore a number of different areas. And so I was able to do some research on time perception, looking at how it relates to other cognitive phenomena, like things like mind wandering, how mind wandering, which is something we all do, affects our experience of time, looking at different types of neurochemical features related to timing, and a whole host of other things. In Oxford, I was also had a good opportunity to do a lot of studies on synesthesia. So again, synesthesia was something I was always very interested in. I think synesthesia is an incredibly fascinating phenomenon because individuals with synesthesia have a fundamentally different experience of the world that is very tangible and easy to describe. But I think it reminds us that basically we all experience the world in a slightly different way.
Yes.
And we're not always aware of that. But with synesthesia, it just brings that right to the forefront.
I do have some personal anecdotes regarding synesthesia with regards to kind of psychedelics and some experiences of my own and other people. So, for example, for people who don't understand or don't know what synesthesia means, is kind of the difference between, so I'll describe it then as seeing sound. You know, traditionally we hear sound, but being in a psychedelic state, being actually able to see the sound waves coming out of speakers, for example. And I'll always remember a fascinating story, which was a kind of extreme example of it, but where a fellow was, he was sitting in a party, and I think he'd taken psilocybin mushrooms, and he was actually seeing speech bubbles appear. People were talking, and whilst he couldn't actually hear what they were saying, these speech bubbles were appearing above. And when he checked then subsequently what the people were talking about, they were actually talking about what he was reading in the speech bubble. So it's a very fascinating subject. It just goes to show our kind of conventional understanding of the senses and how they work is all up for questioning. Am I right?
Yeah, no. So as you kind of pointed out, so synesthesia is quite commonly experienced under the influence of psychedelics. And in the context of studying people with synesthesia, so people that have what is known as developmental synesthesia are typically about 1 to maybe 4% of the population.
Okay.
So it's rare, but not extremely rare, such that most people, they may not be aware of it. They probably have a friend or they know somebody with synesthesia, right? You know, just around here in the large center that I work in, the Center for Cognition Neuroscience, there's a handful of people that have synesthesia, for example. And so it comes out once in a while here and there. So in addition to studying these individuals, bringing them into the lab, looking at how they differ on different types of cognitive tasks, how they differ in terms of using neuroimaging or using non-invasive brain stimulation to study various characteristics of these individuals, we've also gone into and became very interested in how and to what extent psychedelics might trigger synesthesia. So as you pointed out, this is an incredibly common phenomenon. It's very widely reported in the literature. So beginning about 2011, 2012, my colleague David Luke, who's just down the road at the University of Greenwich, who's done a tremendous amount of work on psychedelics. And
I'm familiar with David's work. So.
Yes, you probably know David Luke, and some of your listeners will as well. So he's done he's also been played an instrumental role in a lot of work that's going on, and also has organized Breaking Convention for a number of years, and really, you know, helped develop into this massive conference now. So David and I were, we started to couple our common interests and, his expertise in psychedelics, my expertise in synesthesia, to bring those together to kind of try to get a better understanding of what's going on. So in the first instance, basically what we did was we just looked through the literature to find what was going on here. And so we wrote a paper back in 2013 that basically just incorporated all the data we had at that point across a wide range of different studies. This is what's known as a systematic review. We basically just looked through all the studies, reported some of the commonalities in the literature to try to get a sense of what we knew at that point. And unfortunately, kind of what we found was that the evidence wasn't really that strong, mostly because the studies were methodologically quite poor. But what we did find was that there was a broad set of studies indicating that when you gave people psychedelics, they reported synesthesia-like experiences. So then more recently, we did a large-scale survey because one thing you had in this literature we found was that there might be basically a bias towards specific drugs. So we know, for example, that people report synesthesia under the influence of LSD, and that's something that's widely reported in these studies. But what we don't know is, do people also report synesthesia with something like nitrous oxide?
Okay.
Did they report it with cocaine, right? Like, so we had never seen anything like that, but we thought that there might be kind of a reporting bias, and we wanted to kind of further probe that. So more recently, we did a very large-scale survey of drug users. Without mentioning anything about synesthesia, we just brought in recreational drug users and asked them, what drugs have you taken amongst a set of, we did the study quite a few years ago. We're about to submit it finally after some delays, but we only looked at 28 drugs, so it wasn't as systematic as it probably could have been, but it covers all the kind of the main drugs, basically, the main recreational drugs. And basically, we then asked them, you know, under the influence of this drug, have you ever had synesthesia? If so, how frequently? Okay. And one thing we corroborated was that LSD was still #1. Okay. So amongst people that consumed LSD, don't quote me on this number because I'm just remembering off the top of my head. I believe it's quite high. I believe it's about 57% of people will report some experience of synesthesia. Now you have to be careful because it's purely self-report.
Yes.
And we define synesthesia in a careful way, but some of these people might have said, oh yeah, I've had synesthesia, even though it might not kind of meet more rigorous criteria for what we would consider to be synesthesia. Yeah. Nevertheless, there's a clear kind of pattern. What was notable is that other drugs that fall in the kind of the tryptamine class of drugs, which is drugs like LSD, psilocybin, that these drugs were characterized by the highest rates of drug-induced synesthesia. Okay, so that was quite interesting. We also find that that synesthesia, induced synesthesia, is actually quite common with a range of other drugs. So it's still quite common with ketamine, with MDMA, with ecstasy, with salvia, with cannabis, and so on. But there's still this kind of general kind of pattern where when you move away from the tryptamines like LSD and psilocybin, the incidence rates of drug-induced synesthesia go down considerably. And then notably, when you get to what we might call like harder drugs and stimulants, the incidence rates are incredibly low. Okay? Right. And then when we look at how it relates to different drug classes, what you find is that the similarities for within a drug class are actually statistically unlikely by chance. So for example, like all the opiates have very low incidence rates. They're very similar, but they're all very low. And if it was just data were completely random, you wouldn't expect that. You'd expect them to be kind of randomly spread throughout. And all the tryptamines were all at the top. The opiates and stimulants are all at the bottom, and so on.
Right, yeah.
So on the basis of this basically just kind of confirms that drugs that are targeting the serotonin system seem to be particularly conducive to synesthesia. But there's an ongoing kind of debate within the literature, particularly amongst synesthesia researchers, about whether this qualifies as synesthesia. So synesthesia researchers have often been very skeptical of these claims. So if you delve into the synesthesia literature, these are researchers who typically study people with synesthesia who have it all the time.
Right.
And this 1 to 4% of the population. In that literature, there's consensus criteria for how to diagnose synesthesia. There's accepted criteria that everybody uses, and when we do studies on synesthesia, we use those criteria as well. And the criteria are typically 2 things. The first is that the associations you have are consistent over time. So for example, you made reference to sound visual synesthesia, which is fairly common. A very simple one that's easy for most people to understand is grapheme color synesthesia. So this is when people associate letters and numbers with colors.
Yes, I've heard of this, yeah.
That's about 1% of the population. It's the most well-studied form of synesthesia, mostly because it's very easy to study in a laboratory context.
Right, yeah.
So for example, someone with grapheme color synesthesia, the number 2 might elicit the color blue very consistently, such that 2 is always associated with a specific shade of blue, okay? And this is very, very well documented, and it's very easy to study in a laboratory context. So so one criteria is these consistent, all right? So the associations are very consistent, but that they're also highly automatic, okay? And there's well-established cognitive tasks that we've been using since the 1930s, actually, for assessing whether something is automatic. And so that's been repeatedly shown in dozens of studies that synesthesia is highly automatic in these individuals, okay? Now, the problem that we have when we go to the level of drug-induced synesthesia is this question whether the associations are going to be automatic and whether they're going to be consistent, okay? If you met both of those criteria, then it's going to, of course, look very, very similar to developmental synesthesia. The problem is, though, is that to test whether it's automatic, you have to be able to have consistent associations. So automaticity follows from consistency.
Right.
Now, in order to test consistency, you have to kind of repeatedly probe them with particular types of stimuli. So we were very fortunate enough to piggyback on one of the first randomized controlled trials in the UK of LSD. That was back in, I'm getting a bit older now, I believe that was about 2014 that we did this study. So it was led by Robin Carhart-Harris and David Nutt at Imperial College London, who have been obviously incredibly instrumental in kind of fomenting this new wave of psychedelics research, and have done some obviously excellent work, looking at the neurophysiology of psychedelics, as well as expanding into their clinical efficacy and so on. So they've obviously done excellent work. We are very fortunate enough to piggyback on that original LSD study. So basically, we did a very simple paradigm where we would present people with different numbers and different sounds. And then we would ask them just simply, did you experience any color? Okay. And if they said yes, or even if they said no, actually, we would then ask them to choose what the color was. Okay. And then we would probe them multiple times. That way we can look and see, are they actually consistent? Okay. And so what was nice about that study was there was a placebo condition. Of course, a placebo condition, to be completely honest, is a little bit meaningless with the psychedelics, right? Because when you have psychedelic doses, because people are very easily able to pick up on which condition is the LSD condition, which is the placebo. Nevertheless, it does provide a useful control condition. So what we found was that people did reliably report spontaneous experiences of synesthesia under the LSD in a controlled setting, okay? But critically, they did not report consistent associations. So the associations are not consistent. So when they would hear these sounds, or they would see the numbers, they would sometimes report experience of color, but they were not consistent.
Right.
So on the face of it, according to kind of the classic ideas and the classic criteria used by the synesthesia community, this doesn't meet the criteria for synesthesia. Now, the plot thickens and gets a little more complicated, right? So we then were thinking, okay, well, what's going on here? So these people are reporting these spontaneous episodes, but it doesn't look like synesthesia, at least according to these standard diagnostic behavioral criteria. Yeah. And so what we thought was that we came up with a hypothesis, which were basically is that the associations, these ideas of automaticity and consistency, so the idea that the associations are highly automatic and highly consistent, we came to believe that these associations, these effects are not a true feature of synesthesia, okay? But that they are a feature, this is my dog here.
Ah, beautiful. Gorgeous.
In case anyone hears the crying, all right? We came to believe that basically these features arise in people with synesthesia because of learning over time. So basically, associations become consolidated over time. So this leads to a kind of a nice prediction, which is that people that first start experiencing synesthesia will not be consistent, okay? And interestingly enough, there have been studies on this. So Julia Simner, who does really excellent work on synesthesia, who's based at the University of Sussex, did these really nice studies where she looked at children with synesthesia and then tracked them over time. And what she finds, they become more consistent over time. Okay. So basically, as the associations become consolidated, become stronger, they become more consistent. So in other words, when someone first has synesthesia, first experiences synesthesia, you might not expect it to be consistent. So we then start to think that these criteria that we're using, that are applied to adult synesthetes in laboratory context, it might not really make sense to apply them to spontaneous episodes of synesthesia, all right? So it is still consistent with the possibility that these things still may be occurring through a similar neural mechanism, but at this point we don't exactly know.
Right.
So then another prediction that arises from this, which is very interesting and led to more recent work that we've been doing, is that if you were ever to find someone who acquired synesthesia through drug use,
Okay.
then what's going to happen is if the association should be consolidated over time, they should become automatic and consistent, okay, if they have it for an extended period of time, and eventually should look like a regular synesthete, right? So luckily enough, we found one of these people, okay? So we found a person who we call, in the study, we refer to him as LW. That's the standard kind of terminology in the in case study literature is to give some initials like that. Yeah. So we refer to this man as LW. So he's a very fascinating case. At the time, he was 29 years old, and 7 years prior, he consumed an excessive dose of 2CB, which is less well studied than drugs like LSD, but we do know that it does seem to be partially functioning as a serotonin agonist, as a partial serotonin agonist. So he had consumed an excessive dose, which we estimate, it's hard to estimate exactly, but we estimated it was somewhere between about 3 to 10 times a normal dose, okay? So it does seem to be quite excessive. And just
the dose is generally about 20 milligrams, right? Recreational dose.
I don't remember what exactly we estimated the specific dose was, but we estimated that was somewhere about 3 to 10 times. It's described in the paper. I'd have to look it up.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So he had this excessive dose. Shortly after he consumed 2CB, he started to experience synesthesia. Okay. Sorry, I'm just letting it out.
Right. Yeah, it's all good.
So he started to experience synesthesia shortly thereafter. And what was interesting is he's experienced synesthesia ever since, 7 years later.
A permanent transition then.
So he basically, it seems that there's a good chance that he has permanent synesthesia. Okay. Now, we actually just saw him recently, and he still continues to have synesthesia, and that was 2 years later. So now we're talking about 9 years later.
And what kind of symptoms are we talking about, Dr. Terhune?
So he has a wide range of different forms of synesthesia. The most notable form, the most salient form for him is what's known as face color synesthesia. Okay. So whenever he looks at faces, he has a pronounced experience of color. Okay. Right. And he has a unique form of synesthesia that people with developmental synesthesia, only about 10 to maybe 33% of people with developmental synesthesia have this, but he experiences the colors as though they're projected off in space.
Right.
Most synesthetes experience the color as kind of an image in their mind. They don't experience the color out in the world, okay? Even though they link it up with a stimulus out in the world.
Yeah.
So he experiences these colors off in the world. This is what's often referred to as projector synesthesia, almost as if the colors are projected off in space. And anyway, what we're able to do is bring him into the laboratory to study his face color associations. And using standardized instruments, we found that his associations for a number of different forms of synesthesia were consistent, okay, and in a way that was similar to people with developmental synesthesia. And then critically, his face color associations were highly, highly automatic, okay? So he actually looked quite similar to a face color synesthete that I studied a long time ago during my PhD in terms of the kind of the level of automaticity. It was very, very high and quite kind of notable and quite a very, very strong level of automaticity.
Is he still able to live a normal life, Dr. Terhune?
He does. I mean, what's fascinating is basically he's a fairly well-adjusted, a normal individual. But what's fascinating is originally it was quite difficult, it seems.
I imagine.
So
Yeah.
I think it was quite, I wouldn't say it was debilitating, but it was certainly kind of, difficult to transition to that period. Most children that have synesthesia, it seems potentially are born with it. We don't exactly know that yet, or it might emerge at a very early developmental stage. So it's not as kind of perhaps intrusive and unusual as opposed to a man that develops it at the age of 22, right? And all starts having it, right? Where it's going to be much more probably, it's arguably might have more negative effects, but he's largely kind of accustomed to it and adapted to it, and generally doesn't seem to have any kind of negative impact on his quality of life. I mean, what you see is that, like in many other synesthetes, he has a very positive interpretation of his synesthesia. So if you meet somebody with synesthesia, they usually will tell you that they really value their synesthesia. They find it to be fascinating. They find it to be a fundamental feature of their conscious experience that they wouldn't really want you to take away.
Yeah.
We did a really kind of fun case study once where we had a very highly suggestible synesthete, and we used hypnotic suggestion to disrupt her synesthesia, to make it go away, and then look at how that was reflected in her EEG. And we get these really nice EEG effects where her synesthesia seems to completely disappear, as well as behavioral effects. But what she described to me was that she viewed it in a very negative light. She didn't really like the experience of having the synesthesia stripped away because she was so accustomed to it. It's such a fundamental feature, just the way that she experiences the world, which is quite fascinating because the rest of us don't have that, right? So something that is kind of, it's not necessarily emotional, but there's an emotional attachment to it that the rest of us don't have. And so we're kind of missing out on that kind of fundamental experience, which is quite interesting. But he seems to have that as well. He seems to, view it through a very positive lens. It seems to inform experience and shape, a number of different things that he does in the way he experiences the world in a positive way. So that's quite fascinating. So we've done a little more research on him, and we're probably going to do more on him in the future. But we believe this seems to be fairly good evidence. It is preliminary because it's a single case, of course, but it does seem to be pretty good evidence. You could trigger synesthesia in adults who do not normally have synesthesia, and that under unusual circumstances, perhaps due to the excessive dosage, that somebody could actually acquire synesthesia and experience in a long-term way that otherwise looks like it might be a permanent condition, similar to developmental synesthesia. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. There's always a possibility that maybe he had a genetic predisposition to synesthesia that wasn't really that didn't really manifest earlier in his life for whatever reason, and that the 2CV just kind of pushed him over the threshold.
It's an interesting thought.
It might be, but what's fascinating is no one in his family had synesthesia. So we were kind of thinking maybe, so in case it's not clear, there's good evidence for a genetic predisposition to synesthesia. So most people have synesthesia. You'll find that they have a parent or a sibling or maybe like a grandmother with synesthesia, and so on. Synesthetes, again, normally there seems to be some genetic predisposition to it. And so you typically will see it in families. And we didn't find any evidence for that in his family. We were not able, unfortunately, to do a systematic investigation on basically all of his family members. It was purely based on self-report. But no one in his immediate family appears to have synesthesia. So we don't think he has that kind of predisposing factor. Nevertheless, that is completely possible. We
can't rule it out.
Rule that out, exactly. So that's an interesting case, and we're certainly going to plan to do more of that in the future.
Off the back of that, then, if I might ask you, you're talking about, so I don't know if you talk about it in terms of like congenital synesthesia or being born with the condition, which basically means that I imagine for a lot of them, they'll get to a certain age and discover that other people's minds operate differently. You know, they'd be like, well, it's always been like this way for me. I just assumed everybody was the same. For myself, I've recently discovered that I have at least some degree of aphantasia. I imagine you're familiar with aphantasia, right?
Yeah, a little bit, not
Yeah. Again, there's not much out there. I think there is some studies going on in Essex University, perhaps. But again, yeah, it's a similar thing that I can relate to, you know, having this kind of aphantasia where very, very little to almost zero ability to mentally kind of create images in my mind when my eyes are closed. So what do you know about aphantasia, if I may push you on it? Or is it really not?
yeah,
Oh, that's absolutely
I'll be
fine,
honest,
yeah.
I'm probably not the right person.
No, that's absolutely
I
fine.
certainly don't have much experience with aphantasia or any
That's absolutely fine,
expertise there. Um, all I can say is that, yeah, there does seem to be some consistent evidence that there are individuals that do have these characteristics with a pronounced kind of inability to generate and manipulate mental images.
yeah.
But other than that, I couldn't really say much about ongoing research, though, unfortunately.
That's absolutely fine. No, I thought I'd just have a little ask just to make sure, but I'm kind of hoping that it's a kind of case of where synesthesia can be kind of brought on or in fact taken away, as you were talking about. Hopefully I can work on this aphantasia with regards to, I have a vision to open a flotation center, flotation sensory deprivation tanks, and I'm hoping to also incorporate, looking to speak with Dr. Dirk Proekel and Engelbert Winkler regarding the Lucia light. Is the Lucia light kind of brain entrainment technology the kind of non-invasive technology that you would use? What kind of non-invasive techniques would you use with regards to stimulating the brain?
The primary kind of non-invasive technique that I would use is brain stimulation. We have dabbled a little bit with binaural beats.
I use binaural beats, yeah.
So auditory stimulation. We have some preliminary data to show that that affects your time perception.
Okay.
In a frequency band that's been previously implicated in how people perceive time. So
Right.
it's preliminary, but that's potentially interesting. But non-invasive brain stimulation is certainly the one with which I have the most amount of experience. There, of course, are a number of different, ways of modulating the contents of consciousness. You mentioned, flotation techniques. There's all sorts of restricted environmental stimulation techniques.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly psychedelics are certainly a good one. I know that a colleague once told me about a case of aphantasia where they took psychedelics and they had really pronounced visual experiences.
Right.
It's kind of fascinating because it kind of suggests that the ability to voluntarily generate imagery is not necessary for experiencing psychedelic hallucinations, which is kind of fascinating, right? So yeah, there can be a number of different techniques. Back in the day, we explored a very, very understudied phenomenon, which is the Ganzfeld, which in German means total field, where you basically put translucent goggles over the eyes, typically ping pong balls.
Okay, I think I've seen a little bit about this.
Ping pong balls over there. And what it does is you then bathe the person in red light, and through the ping pong balls, it ends up being a pinkish hue. Now, because your entire visual field is covered with the ping pong balls, you end up having this very kind of homogeneous visual field.
Right.
Typically, they'll also present participants with white noise or pink noise auditorily. So while they're doing that, while they're in the Ganzfeld. And so what ends up happening is you have this very homogeneous perceptual field where basically everything is the same. And there's this technique has been used for decades. It's still unfortunately not used as often as I think it should be, or studied as often as it should be. But it seems to be highly conducive to various types of altered states of consciousness, hallucinations, and so on. We've dabbled in it a long time ago where we did some research on trying to understand individual differences in the response to the Ganzfeld and how it impacted attention. And just going back to that work I was talking about before on suggestibility, we found that people that are very, very highly suggestible and highly dissociative appear to be hyper responsive to Donsfeld stimulation.
Right.
And so I think this hasn't been systematically investigated enough, but I think that these people were very highly suggestible, who are also prone to absorption states, dissociative states of various kinds in various contexts, appear to be hyper responsive to various types of manipulations. So, for example, I would predict or expect that these individuals are going to be more responsive to psychedelics as well. There's some evidence floating around out there, but that's not something that has been investigated. What we do know is that one of the best predictors of response to psychedelics in terms of various types of anomalous experiences, altered states of consciousness, and so on, are these questionnaire measures of absorption. And we know that those are also a good predictor, or a fairly decent predictor anyway, of your responsiveness to hypnosis and things like that. So we think there might be a generic kind of commonality across all these different conditions, whereby these individuals who are very highly suggestible seem to be especially responsive to various types of manipulations of their conscious states.
Oh, fascinating stuff indeed. It really is a lot to go on with it. And like, if anybody is interested in exploring Dr. Terhune's work further, I shall be sure to put all the links in the description box for your papers, etc. Now, with regards to your work on kind of time perception, I mentioned it briefly, but I'll rehash. I wanted to ask you about, I've got a video on my Facebook profile, and it's to do with the DMT spirit molecule studies with Rick Strassman. And there's a anecdotal experience from I think he's a Native American gentleman called Patricio Dominguez, and he goes under the experience where they're doing the intravenous DMT, and he comes out, and the first thing he asks Dr. Rick Strassman is, "How long was I gone?" And he chimes straight back, 15 minutes, and he's like, and he says in his own words, he goes, "Oh, it takes a second to kind of things to kind of come back," because in his experience, he experienced 1,000 years of experience within 15 minutes. Now, that's quite a wild kind of claim, but we'll take the man on his word, because I have read other different stories, folklore, and different things like that. Now, with regards to kind of time compression, I know you've done different variations of study, but what a fascinating proposition to be able to actively, I suppose I can only describe it in the only terminology that I understand, is to put ourselves into an alternate dimension, experience a stream of time as we would in this dimension. So say, like, for example, if you had you've got a paper due, it's got to be done by tomorrow, you can put yourself into an alternate dimension, and stay there for, let's just say a week, 2 weeks for argument's sake.
I'm still listening to you.
That's cool, that's all right. So say you put yourself there for a week, 2 weeks, did what you needed to do, and then bam, you come back to this dimension and not a second has passed. What have you found? What have been your findings with regards to this kind of studies that you've been doing, and what personal kind of conclusions have you come to with it?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned kind of earlier, I think how we experience time is incredibly fascinating. And I think it's a fundamental feature of our moment-to-moment conscious experience. Time and how we perceive it is also just incredibly important for a wide range of psychological functions, like really basic ones. Like, we don't always realize that, but even just simple things like understanding language, okay? So understanding language requires just a simple ability to parse a passage of time in between words and so on and so forth, and understand what words mean and so on. It requires a basic timing abilities, okay? But also much more complicated things like complex actions like dancing, playing sports, and so on, require precise timing abilities. So as an American, one of the most salient examples of this in the sporting context, I mean, I know that we might have some British listeners who are really into football, for example, but what's a little more salient for me is basketball. So basketball in the United States, for example, there's always these contexts where the players will have like about 500 milliseconds left in order to catch a ball and shoot it or to do kind of complex, actions in a very, very short period of time that require very, very precise, excellent timing abilities. And there is some there's some preliminary work on this showing that athletes do indeed have superior timing abilities. Perhaps unexpectedly, we also know that musicians seem to have better timing abilities. There's a really nice kind of classic study showing that percussionists, so drummers,
yeah, makes sense.
Excellent timing abilities. And that makes perfect sense, right? That's exactly kind of what you'd expect, right? If you're going to come up with a subgroup of musicians who should be really good at timing, you'd expect percussionists, right? And drummers are the ones that are responsible for keeping time, right? Timing is also interesting in a clinical context. So timing is kind of disrupted in a wide range of different types of psychiatric and neurological disorders. I'm really sorry.
That's all right. That's all good. This is a stream of consciousness conversation, so we have a little third party chiming in. That's absolutely fine.
Normally she's pretty calm, but she's all afternoon. So we got bad timing here, unfortunately.
She wants a bit of the spotlight.
But anyway, so it's disrupted a number of different clinical conditions as well, particularly in those conditions that seem to have distortions in consciousness as well, so like schizophrenia.
Right.
Another one are the dissociative disorders. So depersonalization disorder seems to be characterized where these individuals will have experience of being detached from the world or detached from their own emotional states, for example. These individuals seem to often have pronounced distortions in their experience of time as well, although it's not very well studied at all, unfortunately. Now,
I can ask something quickly. Sorry to interject. Well, I chatted with Dr. Wong regarding this the other day during my, I was sectioned in 2017 and had kind of a psychotic experience, breakdown, however you want to kind of quantify it. And what I did experience personally was what felt like something else controlling my body. Now, would that be would you talk of that then in terms of detachment? So whereas I kind of thought of it as I was being controlled by something else, in fact, perhaps my consciousness was doing what it normally does, but yet there was some kind of detachment of perspective. What do you think?
Yeah, so that can often fall in the category of experience of depersonalization.
Right.
Subjectively, there can be a thin line between depersonalization and some of the kind of psychotic episodes you might see in schizophrenia. So the critical thing is that in depersonalization, you won't see a full-blown delusion.
Right.
So like, for example, an individual might feel like they don't have control over their arms, that they feel like detached from them, they feel robotic, but they typically would not have a full-blown delusion whereby they actually believe that they're being controlled, right? So in this literature, there's often a reference to as if, right? It feels as if, my arms are under the control of someone else, but I know they're not.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's something and that distinction is actually quite interesting. What are the conditions under which you have these experiences, but then it also triggers the corresponding delusion that yes, I am being controlled by somebody far away, versus the experience of yes, actually I know I still have control, but it really is very compelling. It really feels like I don't have control, right? So that's something that's really quite fascinating. But yes, there seems to be a tight link between your experience of control and your experience of time. Right. So time is, we've known since kind of the period of kind of Hume and others around that era who are identifying the important role of time in the experience of causation, right? So if one thing immediately precedes another in time, it's intuitive to think that they're causally bound together, they're causally linked, right? And this has continued to the present era where most experimental paradigms that are used in the laboratory for studying what we now call the sense of agency, the feeling that you have control over your actions, they're usually timing-based paradigms, right? You press a button and then something happens, and what is your experience of time in between those two events, okay? So your experience of kind of agency and your experience of causation of one event causing another is closely intertwined with your experience of the timing of those events. So I have a colleague, for example, here at Goldsmiths named James Moore, who does a tremendous amount of really good work in that area, and who worked with Patrick Haggard, who's at UCL, has done a lot of really fundamental work on the experience of agency, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of our own work, you're completely right that psychedelics seem to be associated with a wide range of distortions in the experience of time. Unfortunately, I think these are kind of haven't been studied in a systematic way, and so our understanding of them is really quite poor. And whether there are kind of meaningful patterns across different kind of psychedelic states, different psychedelic drugs in terms of how they influence our experience of time is kind of really unknown at this point. But there does seem to be fairly broad evidence that that psychedelic drugs do alter your perception of time. Yeah. You mentioned this example of thousands of years passing, right? Of course, there's always a concern there might be a bit of hyperbole there, but it is also completely plausible that somebody had a continuous conscious experience that felt like it was an extended period of time. I think probably a relatable example is that we've all had dreams that felt like they last a long time. Yeah. So I think we've all woken up from a dream and it's only been, a handful of hours, but it felt like it was a very long, continuous episode that might have even lasted days or more or something like that, right? I know I definitely personally, I get that with naps. When I take naps, they definitely feel like it lasted far longer than maybe a half hour or something like that. So we all experience that. The more extreme example is when you go under anesthesia and you lose consciousness. And that's an incredibly fascinating experience. I have friends and colleagues who have undergone various types of surgeries, and what they'll report is that there's a complete continuation from the moment you lose consciousness to the moment you wake up. Right. And it feels like no time has passed at all, or you might be aware that a little bit of time has passed, but it's nothing like what is actually truly passed, right? Yeah. And that can be kind of almost scary in a way, right? And I think it's kind of less well studied, but I believe that might occur in the context of blackouts, alcohol-induced blackouts, or other types of episodes where someone feels like they've lost time. It can certainly happen in dissociative episodes of like amnesia, where somebody might have complete amnesia for an event or a sequence of events, and then only realize afterwards and not really realize how much time has passed. So, and again, these things can be very closely linked with your experience of self and identity over much longer periods of time. So in the lab, time perception is kind of one of the most well-studied things in our lab. So we do a lot of work on how people experience time in different types of contexts. We're typically kind of involved in basic time perception studies that are outside of the domain of kind of consciousness research per se, just understanding individual differences in how people experience time with various types of cognitive tasks and so on. We were fortunate enough to, again, piggyback on one of the first randomized controlled trials of microdose LSD that was done a few years back. And it was part of a larger clinical trial that was just looking at safety, efficacy, and so on of microdose LSD. And we were able to participate in that and do a fairly simple timing paradigm, which is known as a temporal reproduction task, where participants have to hold down a button to reproduce a stimulus on a screen. So you might see like a blue circle on the screen for 3 seconds, and then you have to hold down the button to try to reproduce that time. Now, the simple finding that we had was that normally what you have in a temporal reproduction task is that for very long intervals, so the longer intervals on the upper range of the task, so for example, in the range of about 2 to 4 seconds, what you typically see there is that participants will participants will tend to under-reproduce the intervals, okay? So when they're asked to hold down the button, they hold it down for less time than it actually,
Right.
okay? Now, what we found with microdoses of LSD, so they're basically not completely perceptible. That's the kind of the standard kind of terminology. I should say that there was a bit of evidence that it was detectable in our study, okay? It wasn't super strong, like participants didn't have any kind of super clearly noticeable experiences, but there was a bit of statistical evidence that they were able to pick up on which condition they're actually in. So it doesn't completely work relative to a placebo per se, but they definitely didn't have any kind of notable distortions in their conscious experience or anything like that. But what we found was that they tended to, relative to a placebo condition, to over reproduce, to hold the button down a little bit longer, which was actually closer to the true interval.
Right.
So strictly speaking, they got better at the task under the influence of microdosing.
Interesting.
Now, there was a lot of media attention for this study, and we were always a little bit nervous about saying that they were getting better. So we kind of just focused on the simple idea that they over-reproduce the intervals relative to a placebo condition, because there are a number of possible kind of interpretations of that. Nevertheless, it is arguably consistent with them getting better at the task under the microdosing condition. But this fits very nicely with a recent model of the impact of psychedelics that was proposed recently by Robin Carhart-Harris and Carl Friston. And it's a little bit complicated, but the basic idea is that normally our perception is influenced by what are known as priors. So priors can be beliefs, expectations, things like this. And one of their ideas is that under the influence of psychedelics, these have less of an influence, okay? At least at a higher level. So they basically believe that your kind of higher level beliefs about the world have less of an influence in the context of psychedelics. At a lower perceptual levels, these priors are probably still retained. And at what levels you might have the priors having an influence is kind of unclear. But one of the kind of ideas of their theories, the priors, at least the higher levels, are going to have less of an influence. Now, this fits very nicely with some current models of time perception, whereby this tendency to under-reproduce these intervals is driven by a reliance on the priors. And so basically what ends up happening is if you have reduced reliance on these priors, again, like expectations, beliefs about the way the task works and so on, then what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up over-reproducing relative to the placebo condition. And that's exactly what we observed. So it's a kind of an interesting finding that fits nicely with both these Bayesian models of time perception, as well as these kind of recent psychedelic, these recent neurophysiological models of psychedelics by Carhart-Harris and Friston. So there's some interesting things going on there. We hope to kind of be able to do more on that. Otherwise, we study a wide range of kind of different effects. We're in the very preliminary stages of doing research on nitrous oxide now, how that impacts your perception of time. But that work is ongoing and quite preliminary. But I can say that having done some pilot testing with nitrous oxide is pretty fascinating. And it's definitely an understudied drug that has clear, pronounced effects on your conscious states.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, it came up with a conversation the other day with myself and Chris Thrall, just regarding the current kind of drug scene in the UK with regards to the free partying and things like that. And it does seem now that nitrous oxide is very prevalent, and also ketamine. So it'd be interesting to see the kind of studies that come out, because I think like with regards to ketamine, it took about 7 years. Sorry, let me just explain. Ketamine kind of became more mainstream with people using it, and I think it took kind of around about 7 years of prolific daily abuse before the signs started to show of, you know, the side effects of what it does to the body. So it'll be interesting, yeah, to find out, because there are some cases of people having some really unfortunate kind of brain injuries and stuff from nitrous oxide as well. So yeah, I'll be keeping an eye on that field for sure, because it all kind of fascinates me. Yeah.
Yeah, nitrous oxide is really quite fascinating. As we've begun to delve more into this literature, We've now found, I believe it's actually the second most common recreational drug after alcohol.
That doesn't surprise me.
It
Yeah.
seems to be more commonly used now than marijuana.
Really?
I'm not sure if that's true, but
Okay. I can believe it. Yeah.
I was very surprised to hear that, especially when we've seen the effects in the lab. But I think we're administering it at perhaps higher doses than you
Brilliant.
perhaps see recreationally. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nevertheless, it's certainly a fascinating drug, but it produces pronounced dissociative states actually, and you know, this is kind of where a lot of our work all ties in, because the work that we do on hypnosis and how it links with things like dissociation ties in with our work on time perception through the link of dissociation, and you know, so it all kind of fits together there. So these experiences of state dissociation, one of the primary characteristics of state dissociation is a disruption of your experience of time, right? And time often will feel like it's lasting much longer than it is. So this commonly occurs in arousal situations, and that's often where people experience state dissociation. So just anecdotally, I had a classic experience of this myself where I was hit by a car.
Right, yeah.
It was either 2014 or 2015. I was going through a roundabout and a car came out. I was on a bicycle and I was going at full speed on like a fairly kind of quick, you know, road bike. So I smashed into the side of this car. I went flying back through the air. I landed on my backpack and I had my helmet on, and so I was completely fine. But what was fascinating is I can distinctly remember it from the time I hit the car. Just before I hit the car, you have this quick moment of insight where you know you're about to hit this car, and it happens so quickly that what's interesting is you don't have the motor skills to like slam on the brakes. So I never even hit the brakes. It all happened so quickly. But I had this quick insight where I basically swore to myself, you know, and then I go flying back through the air. But as I go flying back through the air, that all occurred probably in less than a second. It all unfolded very quickly, I'm sure, but it felt like it lasted about 10 or 15 seconds. As I floated backwards through the air, I had this pronounced experience of temporal dilation where time seemed to be kind of extended and last much longer than it actually did in reality. And you know, I then quickly stood up, and you have this kind of heightened experience of arousal, this fight or flight kind of classic response where you're hyper alert and hyper attentive, and that can often be accompanied by experience of detachment. And so state dissociation is, you know, that all things being equal, that was a fairly minor traumatic episode, and it didn't really have any long-term impact on me, and I was not physically injured, I was not psychologically injured. So in the grand scheme of things, that was a fairly minor event. But in much more extreme situations where somebody is assaulted, they're abused, or in a war situation where someone is might later on develop a post-traumatic stress disorder, what you'll often see is in these experiences of state dissociation, they'll have these pronounced distortions in their experience of time as well. So it's very, very common, such that when, you know, the common methodologies for measuring state dissociation, different types of clinical instruments typically reference distortions in the experience of time. So it's actually like, it seems to be kind of one of the principal phenomenological or experiential features of state dissociation is disruption of how you experience time. So it seems to be quite kind of closely linked to that. And there is some evidence, it's not great, but there's some evidence that these very highly suggestible people seem to be maybe more prone to these distortions, but the evidence has been mixed. But the highly dissociative individuals, they also seem to be more prone to them as well, perhaps.
I can back you up there. I've had my own experience. It's nice when you can read about, oh, you know, your life flashes before your eyes or time slows down. But when you actually experience it for yourself, you have that, you know, that inner gnosis. And I crashed a car many years back, and exactly the same thing, just that time dilation. And on the flip side of that as well, I'm writing a book about my experiences in prison, and there was a fella, we called him Froggy, but he had been in for about 35 years, and we'd been work together, and his kind of head would tilt and his eyes would glaze over, and he would just go into these dissociative states. So imagine he must have spent so much time locked up that his brain as a coping mechanism had just, whatever it done, adopted some kind of, state for it to go into just to pass the time or whatever. So yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those types of environments, there's actually some nice work that I read a long time ago about the experience of time in prison, right?
I spent some time in solitary confinement, and yeah, you can imagine solitary confinement, zero kind of stimulation. Is like, oh gosh, and yeah, time does really.
Yeah, I mean, that's why also these conditions it really does constitute a form of torture that really should not be used under any circumstances.
I'm glad you said that. Thank you. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah, no, I actually have one of my close friends is an advocate in the United States against the use of solitary confinement. It's still widely used.
Some people have been in solitary for years and years, haven't they? It's just
it's really, really shameful that we subject people to that. There's far better ways to keep somebody safe and from somebody else from harming other people. There's far safer ways. The impact on mental health is massive. And what's really scary is, I'm less familiar with other countries, but I know in the United States, what's really incredibly unfortunate is when they're doing it with teenagers as well, right?
Yes.
I mean, obviously just everything we know about the development of the brain during those periods, teenagers are just much more hypersensitive to these contextual factors. So it's really quite shameful that the United States and other countries are using these techniques, particularly with teenagers. I think it's really, really shameful. Yeah.
It is.
But unfortunately, the chance that some of these things are going to change, particularly with some of the administrations that we have at the moment. But there's some progress in the United States that these things are changing, thankfully. But it's quite piecemeal. It's not going as quickly as it should. But there's some really fascinating phenomenological and sociological work on the experience of time in a prison context in these types of situations where time is really perceived to just slow down radically and just proceed at a snail's pace, just so incredibly slow. And this is also something you see in chronic depression, very, very common. You'll hear this, in depression case, in depressed patients with like severe major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and so on, of these experiences of time just kind of going on and on and on. And so we're not really formally investigating that. The closest we've come to doing anything along those lines in terms of that is we're doing some preliminary work with a group in the United States on depression and Parkinson's.
Okay.
Hoping to do study depression soon, time perception soon in depersonalization, derealization disorder. We also found one of the benefits of that's closely related to that. The minor form of that is boredom, right? So we all experience, boredom from time to time, and unfortunately, I'm sure some of my students experience boredom during my lecture.
I'm sure they don't, but go on.
I teach statistics, so.
Oh, right, fair enough.
Statistics are very dear to my heart, and I do really like statistics, and I like lecturing on statistics. But it's just a fact of the world that many of my students are not interested. And so I've certainly induced states of boredom in those individuals. But boredom, again, is a more minor form of this compared with depression, where it'll just feel like it's going on and on and on. And so we have this study that we did a few years back where we did 2 studies on how your experience of time relates to mind wandering and attentional lapses. And what we think is that mind wandering serves a very beneficial function to ward off the effects of boredom, which is mind wandering allows you to escape from boredom. And one of the consequences of mind wandering is that time seems to go by much more quickly. So you have an experience of a compression of time, whereby an episode of time will be perceived as much shorter because you have these attentional lapses, right? So like, if a period of 10 seconds passes, but you're having attentional lapses, you're daydreaming, you're thinking about other things, then you're typically going to perceive that as shorter. And so mind wandering provides a very kind of nice way to diverge from episodes of boredom. We never really looked at the the emotional kind of valence of mind-wandering episodes. So mind-wandering episodes can be both positive and negative, of course. And with one of my colleagues, we have explored that in other contexts. But of course, if it's mind-wandering about a negative episode, then we would probably expect the opposite, that it might be perceived as kind of lasting longer. So that's something certainly to consider. So that's kind of that gets you into the areas of rumination, where you're like ruminating and you're really thinking about, you know, things like experience of guilt and shame, and you're reflecting in a negative light on experience that you've had, mistakes that you've made, and so on. Then that's gonna be kind of probably more like that experience of time slowing down, perhaps, I would assume.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. As you say, it's the flip side of the coin on that one. Well, we've gone for a lot of information here, Dr. Terhune. I'm very grateful indeed. What I wanted to round off on, if I may, I've been chatting to the likes of, as I said, Dr. Dirk, Dr. Engelbert, with regards to brain entrainment technology, and also a fascinating fellow I'm sure you're familiar with, Mr. Carl H. Smith, and his kind of work with virtual reality and all sorts of kind of future technologies, transhumanism, etc. Can I ask, what have, like, you do work using the kind of MRI machines, the EEG machines that you have done in the past? I'm sure you will continue to do so. What kind of cutting edge technologies have you seen or had sneak peeks of that you can see that will facilitate your types of research further, or enable you to kind of get deeper into the understandings?
Sure. So admittedly, I'm at kind of I wouldn't consider myself an old school person, but I'm not using a lot of advanced technology in the context of our research.
Okay.
So I unfortunately am not the best person to ask that question. We certainly use some advanced technology with some of the methods, but not necessarily in the as the topic of research per se.
Okay.
Of course, VR offers really fascinating opportunities. So there's obviously a tremendous kind of surge in VR, particularly with more immersive environments. And as we get closer and closer to that. So a colleague here, for example, is delving into work on the experience of dizziness in a virtual reality roller coaster.
Okay.
Quite fascinating, right? Because you don't have the normal kind of vestibular distortions that you get when you're kind of going down on a roller coaster. It's just purely top down. You just see yourself going down. You have the experience of presence. His name is Alfredo Pereira. So he's a philosopher and is also dabbling in neuroscience. But so he is certainly very interested in that type of thing. And there are many other researchers doing work on VR in a number of contexts, and I think it's going to increasingly become a valuable.
I think so, yeah.
I certainly there are a whole host of potential technologies that could be used to aid consciousness research, but that's certainly one that I think is really quite salient. I know that the University of Sussex is using that technique also for using VR to study hallucinations and things like that as well. But I think just it has, you know, clear potential to study really more complicated phenomena, like things like the experience of embodiment.
Okay.
Then you experience embodiment of a virtual reality avatar, right? And once we can master that and really ensure that someone's going to experience embodiment, then there are going to be a whole host of kind of really massive implications for that. That can have, and closely tied to that can be embodiment of prostheses, for example, in individuals that are amputees, for example, right? So that's a kind of a major bottleneck in that type of work, being able to use the prosthesis, but feel as if it's one's own, right? At the experience of embodiment. And so that whole line of work is really quite fascinating. I should say I'm not doing anything in that area. I do not have sufficient expertise to really say a whole lot about that, but that's certainly an incredibly exciting area, and there's a lot of potential, both for studying basic aspects of conscious, but also applying it within a clinical context, such as things like amputees. I know of work that's using VR within a therapeutic context, and I think we'll probably see a lot more of that. That also leads to kind of clear opportunities for undergoing therapy while at home, in the comfort of one's own home. There's a lot of movement towards apps. Obviously, you want to be careful. I'm not an expert in that area, but we're probably going to see a lot more of that. The use of apps, the use of mobile technology for seeking out therapy of various forms and undergoing therapy of various forms. Almost certainly, I think we'll probably see much more of that over time.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying is resonating for the kind of stuff that I'm seeing on the kind of different technology websites and different seminars. And yeah, I think that allows us to round off quite nicely there, Dr. Terhune. Well, thank you for your time, brother. That's really much appreciated. Was there anything you wanted to round off to? Anything you wanted to revisit? Or perhaps do you have any kind of talks coming up? Or what have you got going on or coming up for yourself?
I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, I don't have any public talks coming up. I'm mostly just academic talks at the moment.
I see.
But yeah, this is really nice. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And
thank you very much.
And best of luck with the podcast as well.
You're an absolute gentleman, Squire. Thank you very much. And I will be sure to put all of the links to your previous talks at the Breaking Convention. I think this year should be going up quite soon, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. Well, yeah.
And I'll put the links up to all the other stuff that's on the Goldsmiths website as well. So thank you again, sir. Have yourself a wonderful evening, and look after the dog there. I think she needs to go for a walk.
Sorry for the disturbance about
Don't be silly. Don't be silly. It's absolutely fine. All the best, brother. Thank you very much.
Have a nice night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, sir.